I'm Laura McCarthy with the Nature Conservancy. I'm so glad all of you are here tonight, and really want to thank UNM Taos and Anita and Francis, who's doing the AV for us, for helping us have the event here, and also the Lore Foundation, which has provided funding to the Fernando de Taos Collaborative, which is sponsoring this event. And our format tonight is going to have 5 parts. You're going to hear briefly from John Miller with the town of Taos about what is the Rio Fernando de Taos Collaborative, then a couple of little announcements, and then our keynote speaker, Craig Allen, followed by a panel of 3 short presentations, and then questions and discussion. So John, why don't you come up? This is John Miller with the town of Taos.
Hello. I'm a little tall. Cool guys, so thanks again, welcome. My name is John Miller, I'm the senior planner for the town of Taos. Just again, I want to thank UNM for this space. It's always great to be able to have a community gathering, and we need places like this to do that, so it's great that this space was able to be reused for community gatherings. Excuse me. And again, thank you guys for coming to share your ideas about bringing our river back to life, because that's what we're trying to talk about tonight, is how do we bring the Rio Fernando back to life. So, just go to the next slide, please. So where is it that we're talking about? Where's the Rio Fernando at, if you don't know? Essentially, we're talking about the top of Palo Flechado Pass, all the way down to the confluence of the Rio Pueblo. Encompassed in that area is about 66 miles of total square miles of landmass, about 780 acres of irrigated land, as well as 6 acequias and 53 stream miles. So it's quite a big area, quite a big process to understand what we need to do to fix it. So why are we discussing drought in Taos Canyon tonight? 99% of New Mexico is in some sort of drought as of today. So as you can see, the northern part of the state is experiencing it a little bit worse than others. And what we're at risk of is catastrophic fire, and what results after those fires is typically large floods. And so when we're thinking about rivers and acequias and open space, those types of things can really impact our ability to use those types of resources. So what are our goals tonight? And the goals of the Rio Fernando Revitalization Collaborative, essentially it's clean water and ecosystem function. So how do we get more water and cleaner water in the river? How do we revitalize our acequia systems, as well as the network of irrigation, agriculture, and partnerships that the community can build from that? And how can we connect our people to river and open space? So 3 big ideas that really encompass a lot of different topics. So I'm going to just quickly go over some of the outcomes that we've identified as a collaborative as important to us. Number 1 is healthy headwaters and forests that are resistant to fire. We've all seen what happens when we have these fires, how our water systems and how our acequias are affected. And so it's really, really important that we're proactive about drought, proactive about forest thinning and wildfire in the Taos Valley. Outcome number 2 is restored and protected wetlands and riparian zones. And so what you're seeing here in these photos, this is a beaver dam and its ability to store water. How do you increase the natural functions of the river to help to store that water in the ground and later release it into the stream when the snow's already melted? How do you sustain those flows through the entire season? The picture on the right is just some identification. It's hard to see at this scale, but identifications of some of the wetlands and the uplands, as well as the lower part of the river. These act as sponges, so they absorb the water similar to the beaver dams, and they do the same type of ecological function where they release the water back into the river at a later time. Outcome number 3, this photo is of Los Pandos Road of last year. And what we're seeing here is a situation where we had a large runoff event. The water was impounded because of a tree that fell in the river, and it overflowed the banks and took out a lot of the infrastructure on the road. What we're trying to do is connect the river back to the floodplain, allow for those meanders, allow for those natural functions to keep rivers from turning into something deadly and instead being something that we can utilize as a community. Outcome number 4 is cleaner flow during runoff events. So how do we work to implement green infrastructure? How do we work to implement things that can clean the water before it gets into the river? There's a lot of different ways to do that. I'm just going to skip over them for now. Outcome number 5 is point source pollution, excuse me. Point source is pollution that you know where it's coming from, right? It's from a plant, a chemical plant, or an agricultural use. It's a little easier to track than the non-point source solution, which would be things like oil on the roads or things like that. Our biggest point source solution point source pollution in the Taos Canyon is septic tanks. So we have a lot of septic tanks. Septic tanks have been linked to groundwater contamination, which later comes out into the river in the forms of springs. And so how do we understand where certain septic tanks are that may be polluting more? What are the actual sources of E. coli in the river? It's all super important to this overall process. Outcome number 6, this is a large one. The Rio Fernando's acequias, from Presa to Desagües, excuse me, that's written a little strange. Essentially, the outcome is to restore the acequias. From the presas to the desagües and everything in between, how can we work to start to identify infrastructure needs, things like head gates that need to be replaced, flumes that need to be replaced. But ultimately, we can get the water in the river, but who's going to use the water? And so there's ultimately that bigger picture of how do we connect people, how do we connect the youth with the farmers, with the landholders, to form land lease programs to actually use the water in a way that's beneficial to the valley. Outcome number 7, this is a little bit what I just talked about. Parciantes and vecinos engaged in irrigation. So repairing the acequias, strengthening their associations and the cooperation between government agencies and these groups. Developing a Rio Fernando Stream Commission. This is a big idea. How can we start to have the different acequia groups talk to each other so that we can begin to share water possibly better? Outcome number 8, increased agriculture land. So Taos has always been intrinsically linked to agriculture. How do we preserve that? How do we allow our children to stay in the valley to farm? Maybe it's not full-time, maybe it's part-time, but give them the opportunities to do that and give them the knowledge, skills that they need to be able to do that effectively. Outcome number 9 is access to the river, trails, open space. I think we all envision a Rio Fernando where there's water, where people can fish, where people can play in the river with their animals or with their kids. And really having a system of trails that links that, connects it, whether it's on the river or surrounding the river. And outcome number 10, I believe this is our last outcome. An improved user experience and reduced impact from recreational users on the watershed. And the Rio Fernando is great. It offers a whole lot of different options for people, whether you're an ATV rider, horseback rider, or a mountain biker, or a hiker. Any of the above, there's opportunities in the Rio Fernando to do that. So just trying to work to improve the trails, the parking lots, the infrastructure that surrounds it in a way that's beneficial to the whole river itself. So, as of this point, our current membership consists of Amigos Bravos, Taos County, and the towns, the Land Trust, the Acequia Association, the Nature Conservancy, and the Forest Service. We've invited a few other individuals, but at this point, this is our current group makeup. And the mission statement of the Rio Fernando de Taos Revitalization Project is a dynamic collaborative of individuals, organizations, and government entities working to revitalize the Rio Fernando de Taos corridor by improving water quality and ecological function, restoring acequia systems, strengthening working land capacity, and connecting people to the river and its watershed. So for more information, these are our contact numbers. It's a great way to begin the process of getting involved. If you could just go to the next slide. We can put the contacts back up in a moment. But how to get involved, we provided a questionnaire to everybody who came in. That's a great way to get your email to us, to let us know a little bit about what you think so far. Another way to get involved would be to sign up for a mailing list. So we're hoping to put together a mailing list to keep people updated on what we're doing. But I think the best way to get involved is to really work with your local organizations that are partners, right? Become partners with them with whatever specific idea that you're interested in within this collaborative. And that, I think, is the best way to really become involved as we move forward. So thank you very much, and I'll hand it back over to Laura.
I'm not going to adjust it, I don't know.
I can adjust it.
No, it's right. Well, yeah, you go ahead for Craig. And will you, Marcia, do you mind pulling up Craig's? So as well, everything he said, and there's materials on the back table. And just hopefully it's okay with folks. We're recording tonight's session, and it will be available online if you want to access it later. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Craig Allen. Everybody should have a favorite scientist, someone who inspires them. And Craig has definitely been that person for me personally, and I think you're going to see why. Even though his messages can sometimes be, they're a little depressing because of what he studies. At the same time, he's an incredible visionary in terms of both being able to synthesize the science so that regular people like us can understand it and give us really clear direction as to what we should be doing about it. Now that's not the bio that was given to me, but that's what I wanted to say. I will add just a little bit, though, that he's a scientist with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's studied in this landscape, northern New Mexico, since 1982. That's a very long time. He conducts research globally now, and some of the really important work he does globally is looking at patterns, trends, and drivers of drought-induced tree mortality all over the planet. So with that, help me welcome Craig.
Great. That's pretty good. Thank you, Laura, and thanks to this group for the invitation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the situation here in the Taos watersheds, including the Rio Fernando, in the larger context of northern New Mexico, the Southwest, and just a little bit in terms of the planet. This will be...
No, I don't think it's because...
Put it in
If you just go backwards.
I can do it. All right. So, starting again, we're going to put it in context, a little bit larger context. And in particular, I'm putting it the largest context is the context of the warming that's going on in the planet, and it's only part of what's different these days than in the past. But I'm going to give a little bit of the history of the landscapes. But what that warming is doing, what we're seeing in concert with some of the land use changes, suppression of fire for a century in particular, it's caused these kind of forest disturbances to increase in severity and extent in the last 20 years, since we went into this recent dry spell that we're in. And what we're starting to see is things behaving different than we've seen them in the past, these kind of tipping points and even the emergence of novel kinds of systems. Go up into the Hondo fire up there, Questaway, and you'll see that's not the forest that was there 22 years ago when that fire went off. So anyway, I'm going to focus with, give examples from the landscape I know best, which is the Jemez, which, as Laura said, I've been working on for a long time. I guess it doesn't show on this screen. The laser pointer. Well, anyway, you see the Jemez there, and Taos pops up here. We've done a ton of work in the Jemez. We'll describe a little bit of it, and we're starting to do work in the Taos part of the world, the Sangre de Cristos. So anyway, this has been my home landscape since the 1980s, and I actually scouted my work there starting in 1981. Been working with land managers, place-based there as a scientist, but working with land managers because I'm interested in the applications of the work. Some of you may have seen a close colleague of mine, so we worked together in this field station, Ellis Margolis, in January, gave a talk up here in the Taos area about some of the tree ring fire history studies. I'm not going to talk much about it, but to tell you, we've done a lot of them. You can reconstruct the history of both climate and fire from tree rings. We're going to talk a little bit about it. This is the Jemez. So that's about 1 million acres looking at it in space. That's a 15-mile diameter caldera. That's the Valles Caldera National Preserve in the dotted lines. And all those dots are places where we've sampled 10 to 30 trees. So this is the best sampled landscape on planet Earth, sampled for fire history in the tree rings. Okay, so the yellow ones are the ones Ellis has done in the last 2 years, filling in all the holes that I and colleagues left. Okay, and he's still dating some of those samples, but it's a lot. And we're going to be able to model fire history, and that is the outline of the Las Conchas fire. 156,000 acres, 2011, and sort of the biggest, baddest fire that we've had, and I'm sure you all heard of it. That slide, so is the trees that recorded fire in red. The red triangles there are the trees that recorded fire in 1748. So people are like, ooh, the Las Conchas fire, the biggest fire in New Mexico history, until the next summer when Whitewater, Baldy, and the Gila went over 200,000. But if you remember where that was, it was the east flank of the Jemez. On the order of 1 million acres were burning in the Jemez in 1748. But it wasn't killing those trees. Those trees recorded fire and survived to heal over and scar. So a different kind of fire. The fires were much bigger in the past, but the severities were different. This is, don't even look at the diagram at the right, but I'll just tell you all those mountain ranges. This slide's 20 years old now, and we should update it. But to a first order, it's the same. All those little mountain ranges there in the southwest were all on fire in 1748. Okay, if the laser pointer was working here, I'd walk you through, but actually I can do it here like this. That's 1748, and essentially every mountain range, at least a quarter of the trees scarred in 1748, and all those mountain ranges across the whole region. But again, wasn't killing those trees. 1748 was unequivocally the biggest fire year in the Southwest in the last 300-400 years. And then those fires stopped. This is sort of the diagram on the left, our individual. Each of those dots represents a collection of 30 fire-scarred trees, 30 trees from each of those mountain ranges. And the diagram on the right is the timeline. And the only thing to really know, if somebody else has got a laser pointer that works, I could use it.
No, I probably do.
Yeah. All this area here on the right is, there's no fires in the 1900s. So what happened here? Okay, now most of you probably know this story, but what really, the Forest Service got serious about fire suppression after 1910, but the fires actually collapsed in the 1880s and 1890s, 20, 30 years earlier, and it was when the railroads linked the Southwest to the outside world, external markets. The number of livestock went through the roof in the 1880s, and by 1890 there were 5 million sheep and 1.5 million cattle and hundreds of thousands of horses, and there we go, burros and whatnot, and they ate the grass that was carrying these surface fires, these different kinds of, and allowing fires to spread widely, probably for months in dry years like this. And what happened over the course of a century is the forest got thicker. All the little baby trees that used to get thinned out, where 90% of them would be killed before they could get big enough to survive fire, now they all survived. And the forest got thicker and thicker during the 20th century, allowing fire to be able to climb from the ground through ladder fuels to get to the canopies and create fires that we can't actually suppress during extreme weather events. So, and these landscapes that used to have, this is from actually even 20 years ago, the south-facing slopes of mountains all across the region used to be quite open and grassy, sometimes completely open grasslands, otherwise low-density forests all the way to the summit. So that fire couldn't get up and run 10, 12 miles in a day. It had to drop down to the ground in between. But that's not the case anymore over large parts of the landscape. That worked. Suppression worked pretty well through most of the 20th century while the fuels were building, and there were some wet periods, multi-decadal wet periods, the last one being from the late 70s through 1995. But starting in 1996, we've been seeing this going on. Both trees dying from drought and heat stress and insects, and from big high-severity fires. And it turns out one of the things that we've learned in drought, obviously, is a driver of this, no surprise, everybody's always known that, but what we've been learning more recently in the last decade or so is the importance of warming in amplifying the effects on both fire and tree stress and insect outbreaks. And just to be clear, the planet and the Southwest are warming. 14, 15, 16, This is globally, and it's actually even a little bit more than that relative to the baseline in the southwest. So we're close to 2 degrees Fahrenheit, about 1 degree C, regionally and globally, up from what it had been. This was an important paper led by a guy named Park Williams, who's now at Columbia University. He was postdocing at Los Alamos. Based on his dissertation work, he used tree rings to reconstruct the role of temperature. This was an important paper and is an emerging classic for the reasons in the title. Warming temperature as a potent driver of regional forest drought stress and tree mortality. And the region is the southwest. Drought stress and mortality. Mortality from multiple causes. So using these old wood things that can go back more than 1,000 years, we can reconstruct growth and climate and fire. We used all the climate data. Park did it, really. I and others, there were about a dozen of us co-authors on it, sort of helping frame the paper, but all these dots here represent basically all the tree ring growth chronologies. It was, thousands of trees and hundreds of thousands of measured tree rings that went into this. So it was a huge data set. And this is tree growth for the back to 1896. So the beginning of this line, so this is calendar years 1896 through 2007, which is what the data went through. Below the line is dry, above the line was, good tree growth and normally wet. So around 1900 it was down and then it was up, and then there's the 1950s drought and then it was wet. And here, starting in 96 is the dry period we've been in, which actually continues, bouncing around down there. And it turns out, what Park found, we always knew you could predict tree growth if you knew something about how much precipitation it was. Dry years, they grow more poorly than wet years. If the winter, spring, before the growing season is dry, it grows more poorly. But it turns out, and the details of this don't matter, but that if you add in the temperature signal during the growing season, when it's warmer during the growing season, trees grow more poorly. And it's surprising because all the tree ring growth, that people had missed this signal. But the signal is strong. It was half the strength of this. And with that added in, you can predict, it's just a correlation coefficient is just how close can you predict something. If it's 1.0, it's a perfect prediction. This is over 0.9, which is crazy good for any kind of ecological thing. People didn't believe it at first. But basically, we can predict tree growth almost perfectly if we know not just the preceding winter, spring precip, but the temperature in this part of the world. And this is for conifers, pinon, ponderosa pine, Doug fir, those 3 species. So, and then it turns out that temperature is also driving increases in fire and drought stress and the associated insect attacks in ways we'll describe here in a minute. But I bothered to show this in part because you can use this record of regional tree growth to sort of explain what's happened to forests all across the region, including here in the Taos area, in the Sangre de Cristos. So this is that record of tree growth. Again, below this line is poor growth and drier. Above the line is wetter. And so when you see the orange band, that's going to be a dry period. And when it turns blue, it's a wet period. So right around 1900, late 1800s, right around 1900, there were some very dry years. Okay? This is when the surface fires stopped, because the livestock ate the grassy fuels. This is the year 1910, when there was a super bad fire year in the northern Rockies in particular, killed lots of people, and that's when there had been a debate about suppressing fire prior to that. Should we not? You can see we had forests with fire. That pushed the balance politically. Fire became kind of job one of the young Forest Service as an agency at that point. So fire suppression is now both because of livestock grazing, but then as the fuels start to build, it gets harder and harder, and the Forest Service and other agencies are on the job in a big way. And all these little baby trees in this wet period, this blue period, establish like crazy and they start growing. But now surface fire is not thinning them out anymore. Here's the 1950s drought, when we know from historic records and air photos and variety of lines of evidence that trees, not only were there some bigger fires, 10 times smaller than anything we have today, but fires, it was harder to control fire during the 50s. No surprise. It also was dry enough to kill trees on dry sites. But the forest, for the most part, got through that just fine. And we got then into another wet period, and from the late 70s through 95, and in that period, all those little baby trees that established in the early 1900s grew up into mid-sized trees, and now the forests are at the maximum amount of biomass that they can literally physically hold. And this is what people like us living in this era, this is what we think is normal. But it's not what was normal 100 years ago. But our norms were reset. But in this period of the 70s and the 80s, those of you who've been around here that long, right? You know, there was a lot of snow, the acequias are good, the agriculture, the skiers, the world is happy, and suppression was still working with these dense fuels. But the fuels are susceptible. And then starting here in 96 with that first dry winter, spring, we started to pop fires that we couldn't control anymore. And as this drought has continued and deepened and the warming has continued, things have gotten more and more difficult, including in the year that we're in this year, right? We're all a little bit on needles and pins from the standpoint of what fire may do this year. We're all hoping we get through the next 6 weeks or so to the monsoon. And so we've been seeing a lot of dead tree forests, a lot of forest mortality from multiple causes. So anyway, this is going on regionally. It's also going on in the mountains and the watersheds right here. So, oh yeah, and that's my timeline for context. This is when I started to study these processes in the Jemez. But notice I came early in that wet period. So to some extent, my career has been like documenting this transition from what it was like during this period to what it's been doing here. So my stories have gotten a little gloomier, Laura, as we've been in this kind of a place. So, what does that look like regionally? So Arizona, New Mexico, the mountains, dark green forests, light green woodlands. That is the amount of, from 97 to 2012, mapped bark beetle, just bark beetle impacts on forests where there's significant mortality. It's about 12% of the forest and woodland area in the region. And it's conservative because they missed a lot of the pinon mortality. They weren't actually mapping it the first year. That's tree killing fire through 2012. If you put them together, it's about 20% of the forest area that was reset or significantly reset during that time period. And of course, that's half dozen years ago now. So these processes have continued. We haven't updated it since. So that's the last 20 years. If you put this in a long-term perspective, you go, well, but there have been droughts before, right? Like the 50s drought? Well, yes, there have. So this is a 1,000-year record of tree growth regionally using the same reconstruction index of tree growth, going back, which we call this forest drought stress index. But again, above the zero line, good growth, below poor growth. So again, wet or dry. So this is, the gray are individual years for 1,000 years through 2007. And the red is a 10-year smoothing average, so you can see the kind of trend, because it's really noisy every year, year to year. Variability in precipitation is completely normal here. Nothing to do with climate change. Naturally, it's quite variable here. And so you can see it back through time. You know, it's dry and it's wet and it's dry and it's wet and it's going on. And you look at it, you can kind of see it's not exactly cyclical, but it's definitely episodic and oscillating. These are things that in the past have been identified as mega droughts. The late 1200s that pushed the ancestral Puebloan people out of the Four Corners area. The late 1500s drought that until recently has been thought to be the worst drought in the last 1,000 years in the tree record. Here's the 1950s drought, and through 2007, this is where we were here. That, when you get down to this level of drought stress, we have evidence that that's a level that can kill trees, okay? That tree growth is so poor, they're under so much stress, so we get things below that. And then, just one last one. You see this here, this one gray line, that's 2002. And if you look across, you see there's nothing in the last 1,000 years, like 2002. And actually, if we had updated this with new records, which we wouldn't have all of those dots, so we could get a few of them, for 11 and 12, and perhaps 2018, would be down in this territory, okay? But objectively, the trees are telling us that at least through 2007, that 2002 was the worst year by far for tree growth in the entire region. We don't think, in fact, we're pretty confident, it's not because it was less precip than any other year in the last 1,000 years, but it was that combination of precipitation and warmer temperatures. Those warmer temperatures are amplifying the effect of the drought stress on the trees and on these disturbance processes. So what did 2002 look like on the ground? Well, this is just below Los Alamos on the east flank of the Jemez in fall of October 2002. All that orange stuff is pinon dying. And there's what it looked like 18 months later, after all the needles fall off, and the green things left out there are the junipers, the one-seed junipers. So, big fast, and there were about 2 million acres of that in the Four Corners area that did something like that. But it wasn't just pinon, that was a big thing where people lived, but it was all up and down the elevational gradient, including grasses, little shrubs. There were some shrubs that didn't leaf out that year in the east flank of the Jemez. It was so dry. It cost too much energetically to put a leaf on. It was so dry, they decided they'd just wait it out. Anyway, it all down the elevational gradient all the way up into spruce fir forests. And it isn't just in the southwest or northern New Mexico. This is western North America, the first decade of the 2000s, 2001 to 2010. Each of the different colors, this is through the eyes of bark beetle biologists, entomologists. These are where there have been tree-killing beetle outbreaks of different beetle species tied to different tree species. So this massive thing, right? So here's Oregon, this is British Columbia. New Mexico's down here. The blue is the pinon ips, right? This green, though, is mountain pine beetle. Just hammered 25 million acres of lodgepole pine up in British Columbia, which has got the Canadian forest industry really doing a lot of work on this kind of issues. But anyway, it has continued in the last 7-8 years, and it's actually amplified in much of western North America. Right now, where it's big, it's been going on, is in the Sierra Nevada of California. But anyway, big deal, west-wide and globally. And I won't talk really any more about it except to say that we see that combination of hot drought is driving unusual tree die-off events in every major forest type on this planet, all the way to rainforests in the Amazon basin. It's not just places, not just forests in dry places. It's also forests in wet places. What is a drought there is a different, right? In the Amazon, what it takes to kill a tree is a lot less than what it takes in Arizona. But those trees in the Amazon are tuned to grow super fast. They can't take the same level of drought. But anyway, it's emerging everywhere. And this is, again, one of those signals of warming on the planet. These are just places around the planet in the last 25 years, 30 years. All dots represent published die-off events around the planet. And as Laura mentioned, this is the kind of thing I've been working with people around the planet to try to understand this better. Because it turns out we know how to grow trees in models, but we cannot realistically kill them. We don't know how much drought and heat stress trees can take before they die, in general. It's a problem. It's a huge problem. There's some of the best studied species are here in New Mexico because, actually, of the history of what we were showing you. The reason this is a concern is because this is the last 1,000 years of temperature in the northern hemisphere, reconstructed through multiple proxy tree rings, corals, variety of things. So it was bouncing around in this range until the early 1900s. It's gone up, and we're here where it's gone up actually about 1 degree C now. This is a little bit of an old slide. But basically, it doesn't matter. We can't hold it. The best understanding, the temperature part of the models is pretty good. And anyway, the point is it's going to warm a lot. Maybe 8 degrees Fahrenheit more this century. But we're already seeing these effects here. This depends, the different lines depend on how serious we get about dealing with how we do energy and how much fossil fuel stuff. And the risk of this is that that forests, that ecosystems, not just forests, everything from prairies to shrublands to forests, are starting to show evidence of reorganizing under these kinds of stresses. And then when you get something like fire or an insect outbreak, that makes the change happen real quick. So I won't go into the details, but there's some really bad news here in northern New Mexico. But these are 6 different modeling approaches, and they all kind of give the same answer, that by the middle of this century, the warming temperatures caused the mortality of conifer trees. The mountain kind of trees we have here, it looks like it's going to be extremely high. So this is where you may have read some stuff in the paper about like really grim kind of news. I think there'll be parts on the landscape, there's more resiliency out there than people may think, but these forests are going to be forced to continue to change. The question is how incrementally versus how abruptly. And this is where our management, the kinds of things you all are doing here, can make a difference. And we'll get to that. And in terms of fire as a trigger, well, in northern New Mexico, we've seen what it can do, right? So Las Conchas did this thing, and it did this to large numbers of watersheds in the arc around the east-southeast flank of the Jemez, which did all kinds of bad things from a human standpoint, an economic standpoint, because the health of our communities is directly linked to the health of the upland forested watersheds, because down in the valleys, by water and watersheds, and that's why I think you're all here in this project and all of this work. And so this is Santa Clara Canyon, these incredible debris flows off those steep slopes, incision, the whole riparian systems we're trying to actually starting a new project this year, trying to understand. They're recovering way slower than we expected. The magnitude of these disturbances has been so great. Big effects on water quality downstream, got Albuquerque's attention. Laura saw that as the opportunity. The water fund basically exists because of that to some degree. So there's these tipping points, not just in natural systems, but in human systems, and we're starting to see, and a lot of them are linked to, obviously, human health and safety of people living at the margins, but also watershed-related issues, and what that does to the economy. On an ecological standpoint, the increase in the size of the tree-killing fire patches is eliminating the mother trees over large areas and making it hard for forests to reestablish. And so it favors things that don't need a seed that can resprout. So it's favoring grasses and shrubs, and we're seeing this all across, starting to emerge actually all around the West, and this is another area there's been a lot of recent study. In the Jemez, when we look at this, so this is again looking at a satellite image of a bit more than 1 million acres of the Jemez, before all the big fires. That is the footprint of the fires by decade, and we don't have time to talk about this much, but this is the first, this is 2010 through 2013, the red and the orange overlap. That is the area burned in the Jemez compared to everything in all the decades back to 1909. More burned in those first 4 years than by far than in the entire century preceding it. Okay, so this trend has been going up, and this is despite a lot more resources devoted to firefighting. Okay, we're not able to keep a lid on it. But remind you, right, that in 1748, almost that whole mountain range was on fire, but a different kind of fire. So as an ecologist, I'm not as worried about the footprint. We actually need fire in the forest, but the kind of fire I'm worried about is that tree-killing fire, where it's big patches where all the trees are killed. So what does that look like for the last 15, 20 years? And it looks like this, right? That red stuff is tree-killing fire. And it's basically gutted the forests on the east flank of the Jemez. And this is why some of us have been interested in trying to support as we could with a little bit of work here in the Sangres, because we don't want to see that happen here, in these mountains and in your watersheds, and have these outcomes, because people are struggling here to deal with it, as probably many of you know. So, what about here in Taos? Okay? You know, Enjady, we've seen a few hints of these things, right? So here are the watersheds in this part of the world. Ellis put these slides together. So the Hondo fire in 96, Enjady in 2003. You've had some hints, okay? You can't say you weren't warned, okay, between the rest of northern New Mexico and here. Here's the 3 watersheds that are part of some studies that we were doing with tree rings, and here is, of course, the Rio Fernando, the Taos. These are places, Ellis, again, if you've been here in January talk, you'll see some of this. He's working on getting this, the report published. Each of these dots represents, 10 or a dozen trees sampled for fire scars. Wasn't a big study, but there's 3 of these dots here in the Rio Fernando. Okay, all on this ridge separating the Rio Pueblo from the Rio Fernando. This is zooming into that. So again, here's the Rio Fernando. On this side of the divide, this is the Rio Pueblo, the Taos. And so if we look at basically what we found, there's no time to really talk about this, but just the main story is there was spreading surface fire here in these landscapes. Nobody had done the work. Here, this is Pueblo Ridge West, which I should have pointed out is these set of fire scars here. So on that site, each of these little tick marks, there were 13 trees. This is the cumulative number of fire scars. So you can see during this period from 1600 to 1900, there were lots of fires. They were not killing those trees, and then boom, the last 100 years, nothing. All right, so the same basic story has gone on here that we've seen elsewhere in the region. Yeah, these are the chronologies for the Fernando. And we see there was some synchrony. The dots are too far apart. We don't have such a nice network as we have in the Jemez. These are just the first look. But this is in the Fernando, this is in the Rio Pueblo, this is up in the Hondo. In 1664, there were trees scarring in all of these places, just with those few trees we've sampled. So, and in, I think actually the next slide, yeah, and there were 23 years where fires burned in at least 2 of these watersheds and scars. Almost all of those were in the Rio Pueblo and the Fernando. So not surprising because they're pretty close together and we think fires were widespread in those days. Just the last thing about fire, of course, at the high elevations, it's stand replacing fire, tree killing fire, right? You get up into the spruce fir and the aspen stand. So they did a little bit of reconstruction work up there. 1842, this is what an 1842 aspen stand looks like today up in the upper Rio Hondo. Here's a photo from about 1902 looking up the valley in this area. These are some of their sample areas. And there's the perimeter of the fire, more or less, that we can tell by looking at it on the ground. And there's what that looks like today after it's regrown back with aspen and spruce, but it took a while. There's some question whether it would grow back as well today. So anyway, there's the downer news. To end with a little bit of the transition to the hopeful things that people are going to tell you about what people are doing and working is, as from an ecologist perspective, you know, you get this kind of gallows humor kind of emerges over this stuff. Are there any good options? Are we just kind of SOL because, right, things are getting warmer, the forest is too dense? Well, no, because there are things we can do. Even though, again, there is this kind of gloomy, well, okay. Our extended forecast includes global warming and the catastrophic end of the human race, but for the weekend, it's looking like sunny skies, mild temperatures, and a general apathy toward environmental concerns. Back to you, Jim. Right? That's actually, there's a certain healthiness to that. We got to compartmentalize. We can't solve every problem. We can't do everything. But we can do things locally, like you're doing here. And watersheds are a great basis to organize work. And yeah, here's a science. There's a scientist, right? Here's some scientists walking across this dried out lake bed. Just one more study, and we'll solve the problem. Except the hint here, oops, the hint is, hint on findings, too late. Yeah, there's some uncertainties, but we know enough to know what we need to do. We know enough we need to change some things, okay? And we need to start spending our energy on that rather than debating whether the changes that are in front of our face are real or not, because they are. So there's proven management treatments. You'll hear about some of them. Agencies like the Forest Service, we know how to do some things that can increase the resilience of our forests and help them adapt to these changing climate conditions. But we have to just realize in context that these forests are going to continue to change. These are natural responses to changing environmental drivers. They have no choice. The ecosystems have to change. The question is really going to be, are they going to be changing incrementally? And can we foster that? Or are they going to be changing abruptly and overnight in ways that we find very disruptive from the human standpoint? I'll skip those and just say, bark beetle outbreaks are not all bad. They're part of the incremental adjustments. And I'll just close here by saying, Taos deserves it. They've been working on this stuff for 20 years in the Santa Fe area, right? I mean, and it's been a lot of people, it's community working together to do this, to make these kind of things happen. One of the lessons that's been learned is that finger pointing and blaming is not helpful. We're either going to deal with these are big problems, we have to treat large areas. It takes collective action and collective levels of resources. And this is a snarky cartoon about who to blame for the Cerro Grande fire. All right, I burned it to Los Alamos, and the cartoonist didn't even get it right. Okay, the point is, it was a cumulative and collective outcome of 100 years of decision-making by society across the entire political spectrum, no matter where you are. Okay, and it doesn't matter anymore. There's nobody to blame now here particularly. This is the situation we're in. What are we going to do about it? Okay, and there are things we can do. We'll hear more about them, but again, in general, I just would reinforce, we're increasingly going to need to anticipate, adapt, and begin managing for things that have some uncertainty. The past is not a perfect guide anymore, even though folks like us have been saying, well, we should look at the past. There's a lot of societal learning that has to happen, and it needs to involve policymakers, land managers, scientists, and the public at large. We need to have these conversations. And I would just close by saying that despite the risks and uncertainties, forests can look like this, or they can look like this on the same piece of ground, okay? Or they can look like this. And it makes how we manage, we can make some effect on that. And we need to act with some urgency, we need to act collaboratively, we need to continue to learn, and nonetheless, there will continue to be surprises. And with that,
Hold your questions. We made a decision. You can tell us on the comment form that it was a mistake, and we won't do it the next time, but we did make a decision that we were going to go right into the panel, and I'm going to introduce them very quickly, and then we'll have them go one at a time, around 10 minutes each, and then we'll have a good half hour for questions and discussion. So the first of the panelists is going to be Erica Enjady, and she's going to talk about forest restoration on the National Forest. She has an extensive background as a forester and forest manager. She started her career with the Bureau of Indian Affairs in Albuquerque, and then spent 6 years on the BIA, or as the BIA Mescalero Agency Forest Manager. And then she came up here to Taos about a year ago, a little more than a year ago. The second speaker will be Nathan Sanchez, and he's the chief planner for Taos County. He works on long-range planning that helps the county prepare for future growth by collaboratively working with local, state, federal, sovereign, and the public entities on land use, regulatory, economic, and environmental issues. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering technology from Colorado State University Pueblo campus, and has been with Taos County for 12 years. And then the last of the panelists is in the back of the room, but I'm sure when it's his turn, he'll be up in the front of the room, and that's Chris Coté. He has been fighting fires for nearly 20 years in the Rocky Mountain region. He's qualified as all kinds of firefighting, to fill all kinds of firefighting roles. And for the last 5 years, he's been a contractor to the county as the Wildland Urban Interface Coordinator, which means he's been working with all kinds of communities throughout the counties to help you get fire safe. And he is also chief of the Latir Volunteer Fire Department, and is here with his family as well. All right, so with that, Erica, do you want to come up here? Okay, and let's see. Craig, where is the... They're both here. Okay, this is the one that is going to move you forward and backward. Okay. I don't think I have enough hands for all this. But we'll speak.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Originally, I had planned on doing a broader overview of what we're doing on the Carson regarding restoration, and I'm glad at the last minute the presentations tweaked to focus more on Pueblo Ridge, because Dr. Craig Allen did such a really good job of reviewing why we need to do restoration. And so I'm just going to jump right in and discuss our Pueblo Ridge project. So this first slide, I want to introduce to you the project area. It is 9,810 acres. And
I'll tell you what, I'm going to switch it out so you just hold on. It's going to take me a second, so just,
okay.
If you need me to advance, I will, but
Okay.
then you only have one.
So To the north of the project area, the boundary is a Taos Pueblo Indian Reservation, and then the southern part of the boundary, you'll see that it pretty much follows the Rio Fernando, just stays north of it, and there's just one part of the project area that goes south of the highway there. Another part of the slide with the coloring is when she pulls it back up, you'll see a couple of different colors. And the first one is blue, which indicates stand densities greater than 120 square feet in basal area. And so it's speaking in terms of historic range of variability. This is very uncharacteristic of historic forest stands. Typically,
Okay, now you have one. This is forward and that's the...
awesome. And we're like not on the right side.
You should be able to use the clicker.
Several back.
Oh,
Okay.
okay. It also goes backwards for you.
So as I was saying, the blue is areas that are outside of the historic range of variability as far as density, so upwards of twice as thick as what we should be seeing. And the red are slopes greater than 40%, and then the purple is a combination of both of those variables. So within this project area, we have lots of steep slopes that are just too dense with trees. This project is also a priority project for the Camino Real Ranger District and the Carson National Forest. So part of the reason why we're doing this project is because we've been working with a lot of great groups like the Taos Valley Watershed Coalition, and this is part of their overall strategy in addressing watershed concerns. We have a lot of things going on in the project area that impact forest health, insect and disease, things that have increased the risk of tree mortality, and there's incidences of western pine beetle activity in this area. We have the risk of wildfire, and of course this area is within a wildland-urban interface, and Taos County has developed a community wildland fire or community wildfire protection plan for this area. And New Mexico community assessment that was done in 2015 actually identified this, the Taos Canyon area as very high risk to being vulnerable to wildfire. And for all these reasons, we're moving forward with this project and working with some great collaborators in the area. So as we move forward with developing the project, it's really important that we take a look and have a thorough understanding of what has happened in the landscape in the past. And so with this slide, and I'm not too sure how well it shows up, but you'll see a whole bunch of red dots with dates on those. And so those are points of fire starts over the past 40 or so years, I think up to 50 years. All the way back from the early 1970s into now. So every single red dot is where a fire has started, and we did a really good job of putting it out. You'll see the one in Sabato fire was pretty much the largest of our fire history within this area. And so out of all of these fire occurrences, as Craig said, there was a lot of opportunities for fire to go in there and clean out the forest without killing the trees, but because we were doing such a good job, we didn't allow that to happen. Also with this slide, you'll see these purple lines here are modeled fire behavior. And so you'll see that if there was a fire to occur in there now, these are the large swaths of land that could be potentially affected by a wildland fire. So you'll remember on my first slide, a lot of these purple areas are actually overlaid in the steep slopes over dense areas. And so we have a lot of concern for bad things to happen in here concerning damage from a wildland fire. What I like to also point out with this flow is everywhere the fire is going up the canyon and up its slope is a potential for the after effects of flood and erosion and soil damage to happen down towards the Rio Fernando. And so we have a lot of concerns going into this project, and we have to assess what to do about it. Another impact to our community, which again, Dr. Craig Allen showed in his slide, was just the historic activities that had gone in the past. So not only did we do a good job suppressing fires, but we also had human activities that were impacting the surface fuels, the fire activity, the regeneration of trees, and so everything that had gone into the past, that had gone on in the past, is really led up to the conditions of where we are now. The caption on the slide, I'll read it to you, is this 1925 photo shows the loss of topsoil from early overgrazing. The A horizon is literally falling off the hillside. Not only has the site productivity been permanently lost, the change in riparian and meadow habitats may have resulted in some species, some wildlife species not being able to persist over time. And so we're not only talking about impacts to trees, but also the watersheds and to wildlife. So if you were to think about the Carson National Forest and what it means to you, there's a lot of things that might come to mind and how you use it, what's the purpose of the forest, and these are all the types of things that we take into consideration as we develop a project. The project is being designed to protect resources. This includes public and private property and other resources. We're trying to create a landscape that will improve the resiliency of vegetation in response to wildfire and encourage the return of low and moderate fire. What gets me really excited about this project is the actual size of it being a landscape type project. Having a project close to 10,000 acres that's going to really do good things out there on the ground and effect change rather than 100 acres or 200 acres or trying to piecemeal to a project over decades. We're trying to tackle this all at once. So I titled this Restoration Needs, and it could also be the project objectives or project purpose, but these are just some of the things that we're trying to address as we plan for the project. Reduce the risk of high intensity, stand replacing wildfires, basically just restoring the forest structure and the ecosystem processes. As an example of some of the conditions that we want to change in our ponderosa pine stands, we have current conditions up here. You'll see Craig mentioned that these are baby trees, but if you actually age them, they're probably very old. They're just being suppressed from the conditions out there. And then we want to go into these types of conditions where we'd be allowed to do, where fire would be allowed to do its job and just run under there as a surface fire. This is an example of the desired conditions for a pinon forest. So again, we're just changing the conditions of the forest to improve the structure and the functionality of the forest. Currently, where we're at with this project is we're still in the assessment phase. We'll be working towards doing a preliminary EA. We've had some public outreach, public engagement earlier this calendar year, and as we work towards releasing the preliminary EA, we'll have another opportunity for public comment and for the public to have some response, and also another open house where you could get some more detailed information about the specific project. After the presentation, if you like, we also have a lot of maps up there, a couple of ones that I've presented, but just lots of good information that gives you some background as to why we're doing this project. Thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm glad that was something for you. We need, new slides.
Oops, sorry. Right, sorry. If you want, I'll go back to the
Good evening, my name is Nathan Sanchez, and I'm going to talk about the 2016 Taos County QnA Wildfire Protection Plan. It's titled Connecting Communities and Watersheds. Community wildfire protection plans have become the primary mechanism for evaluating risks due to their emphasis on community involvement and assessment of local resources. CWPPs are also an important planning document used by emergency responders and citizens to plan for and respond to fire emergencies. Local leaders and government entities find CWPPs valuable for the purpose of identifying critical needs and prioritizing for funding. Minimum requirements for new CWPPs and updates must address the following items. They have to have collaboration, prioritize fuel reduction, and reduce structural ignitability. And then they have to secure signatures from applicable local governments, which ours was approved by the Taos County Commissioners. Also has to have signatures from the local approval from the fire departments and the state entity responsible for forest management, who is the New Mexico State Forestry. Taos County has a population of 33,084 people. It has a diverse land ownership of private land, Forest Service, BLM, so tribal and state. We've had two large wildfires in Taos County. We had the Hondo Lama fire in 1996, and we also had the Cebado fire in 2003. The WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, or WUI, is commonly described as area or zone where structures and other human development meet and intermingle with undeveloped wildland or vegetative fields. The picture before you is the Taos County WUI infrastructure map. The yellow striped areas is what we consider the WUI. Also in the CWPP, we have to create a chart that shows the communities at risk summary. And what this does, it identifies communities at risk of wildfire. And we classify them either as high, medium, or low in the Taos County. In the Taos Canyon area, it is classified as high. In creating the CWPP, we partnered with Headwaters Economics and Anchor Point, and we had them develop some risk modeling, and fuels optimization models were generated for the county by Headwaters Economics and Anchor Point mapping. The fuels optimization model identifies areas for suggested fuels reduction work and identifies the direction the fire flows through the mountain range. The map here is a representation of the Taos Valley Water Coalition project area. The purple shows the direction the fire will flow. The areas, tan areas are basically where projected fuels reduction projects could take place. Also, we use mapping applications to help determine where more stringent regulations are required for homes located in high wildfire risk areas. It also helped to improve community wildfire protection plan, and map applications also help to complement FireWise programs and enhance neighborhood education. And it helped in justification for grant application and fund requests. In developing the CWPP,
directions to 135 Patio Del Meadows.
So in developing the CWPP, we created the Taos County CWPP core team. And this is a collaborative organization, and it consists of public, private agencies, government representatives, advocacy groups, local community members, and other broad range of interested individuals. It's dedicated to addressing the high risk of extreme fire in the forests, lands, and that are adjacent to our communities. And they also created an operation manual where all participants and stakeholders hold a shared interest in the values as set forth in the Taos County CWPP. All decisions are arrived by consensus where applicable parties can support one specific information and concerns are voiced and considered. Oops. And also the Taos County CWPP core team has established some subcommittees. These are the FireWise Communities Coalition, Project Development Funding and Implementation Working Groups, our Operations Manual Subcommittee, and the Taos Valley Watershed Coalition. The CWPP core team risk mapping and management helps inform the public on understanding of fuels management within Taos County, identification of where fire should be allowed to burn, and how fire should be introduced back into the landscape for fuels reduction. It also supports funding opportunities and increases community awareness and education. When you first walked in, there's pamphlets that were created in correlation with as part of the Communities Planning Assistance for Wildfire Project. And it was sponsored by the Door Foundation. These pamphlets have great information on planning for fire in Taos County. It also correlates with the Taos County CWPP storybook map. You can access it through the Taos County website. Basically, it's a web-based storybook and has great information on different aspects of living with fire. And Taos County was the title of this project.
Can you scroll down? Can you scroll down?
Yeah. And basically it has all kinds of, it has different sections where it explains brief history of fire. If you click on the map, it'll show you information on the different fires that have transpired. It tells you that the fire was in Hondo, the year, the acres burned, so it has a lot of information on the histories of fire. It also has, if you scroll through the whole document, basically it talks about the Hondo fire. You scroll down more, it goes into the Enjady fire, all the information that pertains to it. And then it has information on assessing risk. Basically, it'll generate a map and it shows the red is the high-risk areas and it breaks it down to the low-impact areas. And then this is a great video. Basically, it kind of shows the fire that was in McGaffrey a few years back, and kind of gives a little video of that fire and how they managed it for purposes of fuel reduction. And then this map shows where we've been working with the neighborhoods to create fire-wise communities. And then it has information on defensible space and by fire-wise, creating fire-wise communities. And also examples of community tools on why we should be planning to live with fire. And this is a great, it actually gives you information, updates on what's going on around the state. So that's great. And the final part of it is it links into all the different agencies where you could, if you have questions, who to contact. And this project was also sponsored by the Lord Foundation.
Thank you. Thank you. He's on his way, Ms. Coté. And assistant.
My helper. Clicker. Good evening, Chris Coté. I contract for Taos County as a wildland urban interface coordinator. And the reason I got into that was because I was a firefighter for many years. And I just like, so I've been there out on the ground. I've seen homes burn down. I've been in dangerous situations myself and put other people in dangerous situations. So what we need to do is get ahead of that as communities. And well, we've already talked about this. So the Hondo Fire, the Enjady, and the Ocean Fire are some of the more recent ones in Taos County that have burned homes. Also, track fire over near Raton burned a couple hundred homes. So how do we get ahead of it here? Well, Craig already touched on this quite a bit, but you know, over the years, denying forest fire, which is much needed, we know, we've got this little pickle here where we have catastrophic fires instead of the low intensity fires. So we need to get ahead and start, modifying fire, using fire, even simulating fire, the effects. Okay, so Nathan, this is our group here. Nathan was talking about our core team. There's several other people here in the audience, and Mark and Russ back there, and Bonnie. I'll help out with this. So we need to have some firefighter education, right? That's how we stay safe out there. This is our antenna circle annual 130-190. It's basic wildland fire class. So we're learning how to protect ourselves. Okay, that's thank you. And then public education. Okay, this is actually in Taos Canyon at they have a really great event every year up at the fire station, fire-wise event, education, and potluck, and good stuff going on there where everyone networks. This is an event that we use a simulation table to, it's really neat. We can actually program in wind speed and direction, flame length, and just see what the fire will do there. That's Ray Corral. You can actually light the map with a lighter, and then the wind will take it, and some of them are even more sophisticated and do the time of day and aspects and all that stuff. And this is really important to me to get the children involved with this and to recognize that smoke on the mountain is not a bad thing. And we need to let some of those fires happen out there, and if we start to breed this into our culture, then, you know, we can be in a position where fire can wash around a community, and the community stays safe, and people aren't running for their lives with their hair on fire, and firefighters aren't rushing into danger. And so that's kind of the vision, and it really, we need to get the children involved with that. So how do we do that? Firewise is a really great program. There's some good literature on the back tables there. Firewise.org. Another great program is Ready, Set, Go. And there's more of those publications on the back tables too. So gobble up all this information, please, and take some information home and share it with your communities. So really it starts with defensible space around your home, right? We want to get that fire, if it's coming into our community, get it down on the surface. A low intensity surface fire that can just bump against any structures. So this demonstrates 100 feet out. You know, you bring it in closer, start from the inside, right? Closer to your home, and then work out to that 100 foot. But get that fire down in the grass and the gravel, you know, bump into a driveway or whatever it takes to stop it there before it gets to your home. And then a hardened home is, you know, a structure with non-combustible materials. Metal roof, even there's a fire scientist named Jack Cohen who took a bunch of asphalt shingles. You know, it took a roof with asphalt shingles and took a bunch of pine needles and piled them on the roof and lit them on fire. And it did no damage to the roof. So now we know that composite shingles are acceptable, but metal is the best. You know, stucco siding, non-combustible fencing up against the house. He says a great thing, if it's attached to your home, it's part of your home. So a wood fence coming up to a deck, in fact, we're in San Cristobal last week, the house burned, it didn't burn to the ground, but it was completely destroyed on the inside because a fire, he was probably cutting and it's dropped an ember, and he went in his back room and took a nap, and the fire crept around the side of the house and caught his deck on fire. He opened the door, and it just completely gutted the house. So all it takes is that one little ember sometimes. And that's one of the studies that he is really bringing to light is the embers. He says it's the little things. An ember, one single ember, can get in your gable end vent, you know, get in your wood pile that's under the deck, anything like that, you know, where it can, if it's a receptive fuel bed, that's all it takes. It doesn't take much sometimes. So use some of that literature there and evaluate your home. I offer home assessments in Valles Escondido and Taos Canyon. I go up there quite a bit. So this is, you know, common public mentality, evacuate from wildfire. Why? I'm the only one endangering is my own. The only life I'm endangering is my own as a firefighter, so not exactly. Because we will do our best, but also you have to recognize that we do what's called structural triage. And if we deem a house is unsavable, then you know, we're just going to have to move on to something that we can mitigate. Okay, we have 7 Firewise communities, 2 of them in Taos Canyon, Taos Canyon proper and Valles Escondido. And we do chipper days every summer. So last year we did 162 tons over Taos County. And so this program, you bring your stuff to the chipper, county chipper, and they'll feed it in for you. So it's a great way to reduce fuels around your home. And, you know, we're doing a lot more land use planning, trying to get ahead of it. This is my fantasy. Get a nice wildland fire division in the county. You know, possibly a hand crew which we are talking about with Rocky Mountain Youth Corps and some other agencies. We're talking Forest Guild, talking about getting some crews out there to work with fire and little suppression, but also ignition. So there are three things, I always bring this to the communities, there are three things that determine fire behavior: fuel, weather, and topography. Okay, decide whether this thing's gonna be a raging monster or a little mewling kitten. And really the only one we can modify is fuel. Okay, fuel, weather, and topography. That's winds, wind speed, direction, temperatures, RHs, all that stuff, aspect, slope. But fuels we can modify. So get out there and modify your fuels. Thank you very much.
Thank you for patience with question asking and commenting. So let's try it. Whoever wants to go first without a mic and see how you do. If not, we'll take one of the ones from the table and kind of have it in the back for you. Somebody want to start?
Yeah, if you get a significant fire in Taos Canyon, how soon does that information go on New Mexico Well Fire Information webpage? And who puts it on?
Russ, do you know that answer to that? You knew I was going to ask you.
What happens is that there is a wildland incident that's occurred in the Rio Fernando watershed. Depending on the land management agency, if it's private land, then it's my jurisdiction. If it's Forest Service, then it's Forest Service jurisdiction. So we're going to call in what we call initial sizable incident report. And that will go immediately to the Taos Zone Dispatch. It'll be called in to see how quick it gets on the website from there. I know it'll be there the next day, but whether it's in there within an hour, hour and a half, I don't know how fast it actually gets onto the webpage.
And can I just ask, did everyone hear that okay? Or do we want to use the mic?
Use the mic.
Do you want to do a shortened version, shortened answer?
Short answer for what? Realistically, anytime we have a wildland incident, it doesn't have to be just wildland. The dispatch centers are notified what's going on. And if it's a wildland incident, then it will go to State Forestry, who is my direct boss, but it also goes to the National Forest Dispatch Center in town. And at that point, one of those two agencies, whoever types the fastest, it'll end up on the Southwest Coordination Center site. If we are asking for resources, then it goes to Albuquerque, and they're the ones that make the decision whether we get hand crews or air tankers or this type of thing. How fast it gets on their information website, I really don't know. I've never timed it, let's put it that way.
Thank you.
Who else? Marcia, behind you.
Does the county do reverse 911, or how do you do evacuations?
Okay, my name is Russ Driscoll. I'm the chief of the fire department of Taos Canyon. Taos County does not have the ability to do reverse 911 at this time. Every structure in Taos County has to have an address. And with that addressing system, the GIS system, that will allow them to break out a particular location to send that reverse 911 to. How many of you have got landlines, have got hardwired phones still in their house? Okay, less than 50%, okay? Reverse 911 only works with hard lines, does not work with cell phones. You have to register with your cell phone provider, tell them your location before that 911 is going to come to your cell phone. If you're doing cell phone through internet, okay, a link, you need to let them know what's going on because it does not work. Quick case, the large fires that happened in California this last year, and they were evacuating thousands of people. Between social media reverse 911, and what we know as Amber Alert, they also use in the fire notification area, or like tornado warnings can be used also in that same National Weather Service. They had less than 21% penetration rate to the public out of all of that. It came down to law enforcement and other people knocking on doors telling people to leave. And that's realistically, here, I'm chief up there, this is what's going to happen in Taos Canyon. We have no cell phone service. Most people are part-time residents. They don't have hard lines anymore. They've got link-ups through their internet provider. So their electricity will probably be out. I mean, let's face it, it's a perfect disaster looking for a place to happen. So realistically, law enforcement and or other agencies will be coming in and knocking on doors and telling you to travel, because we only have one road, either east or west, and to go to an evacuation center at that point.
There's a question on the back.
I know we're in stage 2 fire restrictions now, and I'm wondering if and when the forest closes, what kind of signage will be put up? I know some people were talking about wanting to see some banners at the bottom of the canyons, or how will that be communicated to the public about if there is a closure of the forest? I don't know.
So the Carson National Forest has a public affairs officer, and she has a communications plan in place for a lot of different situations. And so when it comes to fire restriction, she will try to give advance notice. For instance, when we went into stage 2 restrictions, I think that notice came out on Monday, stating that it was going to be effective on Wednesday. So as much lead time as there is, we will get the public informed about that. And as far as signage, I don't know the specifics of that, but we do have a fire prevention type of implementation plan that goes with informing the public with those about the restrictions. And so you'll see all of those come out if we get to that situation. And we have to take into consideration a lot of different factors when we decide to go into restrictions. Some of those include fire activity, how many fire starts are we getting, what's the current weather conditions, what's the future forecasted weather conditions, what are the availability of firefighting resources within our area, immediate area, and then within our region. And so a lot of different factors go into making those decisions.
So I just wanted to add on to the comment about fire and reverse 911. I lived in Los Alamos during the 2011 Los Conchas fire, and it was horrible, to say the least. But it took a community coming together to speak to each other about, or to warn each other to leave our neighborhood, only because they had lived through the Cerro Grande fire, so they were well aware. Reverse 911 was actually implemented during that time, during the Los Conchas fire, and a little bit after, and it still was really inefficient. So know your neighbors, know your law enforcement, know your fire protection people well, know them well. That's the only way you're going to get out. That's terrifying, I'm sorry. I should have said that.
All right, I'm going to ask Craig Allen a question. So one of your slides kind of showed a pattern of like the Jemez, and pretty much every mountain range in New Mexico had a lot of red stuff on it, but the Sangres were pretty green. And so it made me think that maybe things are happening slower in the Sangres, and so could you speak to that? Was that is there a pattern there? And if so, does that tell us something about a window of opportunity to get prepared, both in our communities, but also to help the forests make a graceful transition?
Yeah, I mean, we wonder about that. Nobody's studied that, looked at it that closely. There's also people, if you just look at the Jemez, the east side's all been burned had a lot, and the west side, much less so. And so there's some commentary about, is this just bad luck? Is this just, the wrong ignition on the wrong day? So there's some of that. I think some of it is that. Part of it, the Sangre de Cristos, compared to the west side of the Rio Grande Valley, the west side of the Carson, or the west side of the Santa Fe National Forest, the Jemez and the Tusas, the Sangres are higher. It's 2,000 feet higher. Right, the high peaks here are 13,000 feet. The highest peaks in the Jemez are only 11. There's only a couple of them. So there's more high elevation terrain. There's just more higher, cooler, wetter terrain up there that is not, the fire season is shorter up there, almost every year. But it's not invulnerable, and there's all this, when I first was working here in the 80s, there was, people would talk about things like the asbestos forests up in the Pecos wilderness, right, up in the spruce fir stuff, and pinyon juniper woodlands, conversely, down low. That both of these are like ignitions rarely would do much in those places. Down in the PJ, mostly because there's so little surface fuel, it wouldn't spread, it would have a hard time. The canopies weren't quite close enough to spread. Spruce fir, presumably because it was during that wet period from the late 70s through the mid-90s. But we've also seen, there have been a number of these fires. I mean, the Hondo fire, it went from the bottom to the top, and it didn't take very long to do that. And there have been a couple around Santa Fe now. If you start looking, if those maps were updated, it would be filling in the holes. And so, I would say one other thing on the Sangre de Cristo side is that the west, particularly the west flank, is steep. It's fault block. The stuff on the west side of the Rio Grande is mostly volcanics. So it's a big, the fault block stuff, and it's tipped this way, and it's tipped that way so that the block went up, and that west-facing slope with the Rio Grande there is steep. You can really see that, like if you go up into the San Luis Valley, you just see how steep. So the life zones are all compressed real tight. There isn't a big area of like ponderosa pine forest. There's not, whereas some place like the Jemez has got a lot of forest, and ponderosa pine had that high frequency fire regime pre-1900 because it's a zone that dries out enough almost every year. There's always a fire season every year in ponderosa pine system. Just sort of a question whether you had ignitions and if it had burned recently enough in the past to have knocked those surface fuels down. But I think there's something about that steep west side. Well, anyway, I could speculate out a few other things, but yeah.
Other questions?
Is there a possibility that the town and the county are going to...
Is there a possibility that the town and the county are going to ban fireworks for the 4th of July?
The town's already done it.
It has?
And what about the county?
It's in the burn ban. They've implemented there's a burn ban, but they haven't made a decision on fireworks as of yet. But the county commissioners will meet and they'll create a, last year they did, I think.
Other questions? On your...
My name's Mark Schutz, and I've been working on thinning crews since, intermittently since 1980 or so. And even when I was a kid, I grew up in the East Mountains, so what Dr. Allen was saying about the new normal we're used to with the trees all touching was just still familiar to me. In fact, we went and visited my family's old homestead a couple weeks ago, and I was like, oh yeah, and look, there's where I thinned, and look how all the trees are still touching. And so I wanted to just bring up about tree spacing for anyone who's living in the woodlands and the forest, and maybe share with you the perspective I've been through, because early on we barely wanted to touch a tree. We wanted to save them all, we loved them all, and now we are learning that even without the extremity of climate change, the increased density of the forest is drying the whole forest, because all those straws drinking from the same cup, none of them are getting enough moisture. the statistic I've heard is that the standing green trees can get drier than cured firewood because they're all trying to, I don't know if that's true, but I know they can get very dry. And so you have this spontaneous combustion or almost spontaneous. It seems, I know that question Dr. Allen just addressed here when we had the Hondo fire, it actually went through a number of those life zones until it hit timberline. So we have some protection with our elevation, but it's limited. I think most of all in wanting to speak tonight, I just wanted to share my increasing comfort with big spacing between trees. And that can be balanced. I know people like their view sheds screened and the feeling of a thick forest and all. It has a pleasing aspect to it, but the intermix between a savanna and clumps is maybe a solution approach for people who are looking at defensible space around their homes or looking at thinning projects when they travel on our roads. Different strategies, a myriad of different strategies of approach are being addressed to try and not have forest thinning or logging that's attempting to reduce fuel load be too stark, not be too thin that soils wash away, and at the same time wide enough so that fire can legitimately have a chance of staying on the forest floor instead of running through the canopy and killing killing really everything that lives there except scrub. So that's what I just wanted to bring up for folks to think about. And Coté's comment about the fire triangle and the three components of it was topography, weather, and fuels, and just bring that to everyone's attention. That's the one area where we can have some hope at intervening, particularly close to our homes and on the check dams or fuel breaks that were recommended by Anchor Point under the support of the Roar Foundation. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
I'm just a renter in Taos Canyon, and I appreciate what you said. I have absentee landlords who won't do anything on large property that I live on. I don't want more studies or signatures. I want work crews to work on the understudy and the spacing of the forest. Can we, even though a lot of us are retired, can we do something now this summer to get crews, even minimum wage? There's so many people out of work in Taos. Can we do something now, please?
I just want to mention the Taos Soil and Water Conservation District has a cost share program that's worth applying for. They'll pay 85% of the fees for a contractor to come in and get some work done on private property. We also recently completed a non-federal land grant, which was about 130 acres or so in Taos Canyon. And we have the Pueblo Ridge project going. So Taos Canyon is getting a lot of attention. But for private homeowners, the Soil and Water Conservation District is a real winner.
Actually, I want to speak to the point about workforce and jobs, because there is also effort going into that, starting with the base of the Rocky Mountain Youth Corps and the people that they train, and then creating intermediate career ladders for people to either work for the agencies or on, hopefully, someday the 20-person hand crew that Chris mentioned, and as well, we hope, a partnership with UNM Taos to help those who want to start thinning businesses get what they need to support that. So, very good point.
It's more of a comment than anything else on absentee landowners. What's the land use policy on these people? Is there a fine that you can implement against these people for not taking care of their properties?
We do have a solid waste ordinance, and if they could file a complaint through our solid waste, and they do have enforcement where they could go in and look at the property, and if it's, I believe they do have a section that does cover brush and overgrown vegetation.
The other question I have is encroachment. You know, you see the foothills around Taos, they keep building and building closer to the forest. And if you look at the Weimar area, that area is so thick with pinon and juniper and pine. That's one of the highest fire-prone areas there is here in the valley. And I know it's you guys are working up the higher terrain, but you're forgetting the lower terrain. This is where the fire starts. You know, this is where the people are. And there's nothing being done about that area. Mark and I have talked about it, we've looked at it, and you can look at those slopes, you can't even see between the pinons right there. You know, granted, there's a lot of private property there. It should be the individual's responsibility. But, you know, where does the county and the Forest Service come in and say, hey, look, you have to take care of your property or you're going to be fined? That's what we need. We need action.
Yeah. In our current land use regulations we're amending our land use regulations, and we are creating regulations in WUI areas, that if they're building in a high impact area, they're going to have to follow they're going to have to do an assessment of their property. They're going to coordinate with our WUI coordinator or the fire chief, where he'll do an assessment of the property, and he'll then know what they have to do and then plus they're required to do defensible space also on their property.
I have a question for Dr. Allen, probably. The restoration that we do in Ponderosa, do you see evidence that that is in hotter, drier climate? Is that a mitigation, actually? Do you see any evidence that those types of restored stands are doing better?
In the sense of they're more resilient to drought stress in particular? And
not necessarily in light of fire. I mean, I think that we know that we're doing good things in terms of fire, but in other ways.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a win-win from that standpoint. It does both. It's both a fire hazard reduction, and it does increase it's sort of like the thing Mark was saying, if you got 1,000 stems per acre competing for water versus 100 stems or 50 per acre competing for limited water during dry periods, there's more water available per individual, they're gonna do better. So yeah, no, there's evidence of that. And in fact, in the last 2-3 years, there's been, I don't know, at least a half dozen, research papers published summarizing that, answering that question, sort of yes, in the West. So yeah. Just one other little small thing I would say relative to water, when you think about water supply, thinking about I was thinking of the intro talk that you gave there about sort of restoring a living river, this notion of a river. There is a sense that also when there's tenfold increases in the density of trees in the forest and the watershed, there's been some reduction in stream flows. It's hard to quantify, the baseline data aren't good, but and there are people working on trying to understand better, but for two reasons. One, when you got more trees, they're pulling the groundwater when they're competing for water with each other, and water goes out through their leaves, through their needles. Transpiration is a thing, and it's a big deal. After these fires, we see a lot of streams that are ephemeral actually become more perennial when the trees have all been burned off, kind of like almost overnight sometimes, even when it's still dry, because the base flow is coming up. In the medium run, getting rid of all the trees isn't a benefit, because then you'd have more evaporation, you need some shading, so there's a balancing zone, and people are trying to figure out where that is, between having enough shading so that snow that gets to the ground doesn't just sublimate back to the atmosphere, which is the other reason, by the way, when there's really dense forest stands in this climate, you've all seen this after snow, the snow catches on the tree crowns, a certain fraction of it, and it's pretty a lot here, the storm blows through, the sun comes out, and it goes directly from snow to water vapor. And it doesn't even melt, it doesn't even drop to the ground. And so a certain amount of it, sublimation is the technical term for that. But it's actually, it turns out when you quantify it, it's a big part of the water budget here, particularly in the Southwest, where the relative humidities are so low and the sun is such a thing. So anyway, so getting somewhere down to, if you got 80% tree cover, you're actually reducing the amount of water that's actually getting down into the streams and keeping it alive. So a lot of these treatments will have benefits in terms of reducing fire hazard. They'll have benefits in terms of increasing the resilience of the trees that are left to drought stress and insects. And they should have some benefits in terms of water available for the rest of the ecosystem and for humans as well.
Great, all right, we have time for 2 more questions.
Just briefly, in response to Peter Rich's inquiry and Craig's really astute comments there, just 2 subjective observations. In the West Moreno, we were part of a mop-up crew that followed a feller buncher that was really opening up a forest that had been, I think there had been 4 or 5 entries into that forest. It was really messed up, and so really good restoration effort. And I have a couple of photos that show when we started this, the dent stand was all real brown. This is 01. It was in the middle of that real dry spell, that last dry spell. And there wasn't much summer rain that year either. I remember we started 2 fires by accident with chainsaws and caught them, thankfully. But anyway, after the forest had been opened up for about 3 months, follow-up photo, the remaining trees were obviously bright green, and as compared with the whole forest looking like needle drop in the fall, real rusty color. And then in El Salto, I think it's been 3 years, we were part of a 40-acre thinning project there. And after we finished, I think that was Rio Grande Water Fund's maybe first project in Taos County, right, Laura? And subsequent to the thinning, I got a call from a buddy of mine, Michael, that lives on the hill there, and he said, would you come up? I've had something interesting happening at my house. And I said, oh yeah, I'll be by. And he had a spring arising in his basement. He lived there for 25 years. And I said, are you going to sue us, Mike? And he said, no, I already had a flood in here, so everything's up on blocks already anyway. But I have never had a spring inside my building. He said I had weep holes and French drain around the building because his structure is backed into the side of the hill. And he said that spring ran for at least 3 weeks, and he'd never had it happen before. This is immediately subsequent to, yes, a wet spring, but the sublimation, the evaporation from the tree canopy that Craig described wasn't occurring that year. So the water infiltrated. I walked upslope behind his house looking for, well, there must be a snowbank back here, a big one, 80 or 150. No, it was a half a mile to the snowbank. This was accumulated snow that had soaked in weeks before, arising and coming out of the ground and running down and contributing to a stream. So it apparently generates water to reduce the canopy. Yeah, so.
All right, anybody have a burning last question? Okay. Well, remember to fill out those comment forms and let us know what you thought, because this is the first in a series, and you should mark your calendars for June 28th at 5:30 at the Ag Center, where there's going to be a follow-on about drought, what to do, and that one's going to focus on surface and groundwater as well as the regional water plan. So if you're interested in water, show up for that one. And then just help me now thank our 4 incredible speakers. Number 5, Moore Foundation and Untitled Chapter.